menial jobs. Overall, these trends suggested that Black women would be excluded from so-called modern forms of work, using machines as typewriters, textile looms, or sewing machines, and those defined by a set number of hours each day. Large-scale migration out of the South did not take place until World War I, when for the first time Northern and Midwestern defense industries beckoned with well-paying jobs. Black women were an integral part of this migration, contributing to the war effort as workers in factories and on railroads. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s brought Northern African Americans into the Democratic Party in great numbers, but in the South, federal aid and public works programs were controlled by local white politicians. These officials saw no need to assist the large number of Black families devastated and displaced by the collapsing cotton economy, arguing that if there was laundry to be done or cotton to be picked for white folks, state and federal government should not provide Blacks with jobs or relief of any kind. During the 1930s, for the first time in the nation's history, the federal government sought to mitigate the harsh effects of unfettered employer power when it came to wages, hours, and working conditions. Nevertheless, the signal achievements of this era, Social Security and minimum hour, maximum wage, and anti-child labor legislation, explicitly denied these benefits to workers in the agricultural and domestic service sectors, and to anyone who held a seasonal or part-time job. These restrictions affected approximately 85% of all Black workers in the United States. And two, federal initiatives often mandated racial segregation. In the Civilian Conservation Corps, for example, a New Deal program, the Federal Housing Authority of 1934, required that new housing be segregated if building contractors were to qualify for government loans. California has always beckoned to all kinds of people. For a number of reasons, Black people did not take part in this pre-1941 migration in large numbers, at least, for several reasons. Many lacked the means to buy a train ticket. Even those who could afford a car knew that the cross-country journey was a perilous one, without predictable sources of fuel for the car or food for the body along the way. Most significantly, though, California employers already had an abundant supply of labor, and major manufacturers made it clear that they would not hire Black applicants, male or female. It was not until the nation was well into World War II that the state's employers felt an acute labor shortage. Even then, it took the combined pressure of the state's NAACP, National Urban League, and Congress of Racial Equality to open the factory gates to African Americans. Blacks in California were also part of a national movement, the Double V for Victory campaign to defeat fascism abroad and racism at home. The sudden availability of well-paying defense jobs for Black men in 1942 and for Black women not until 1943 or so led to 5 million Black people migrating out of the South and into the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast. Seemingly overnight, the newcomers transformed whole regions of California, including the San Francisco Bay Area. The intense demand for labor was not sufficient to overcome generations-long practices that adversely affected Black women and men. At the beginning of the war, in response to pressure from Black activists, the federal government created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, an agency that monitored federal defense industry contracts to ensure job opportunities for Black workers. At the same time, a government job placement agency, the United States Employment Service, and its Women's Advisory Commission catered to the prejudices of white employers and their workers. Some Black women were hired as welders and riveters, factory jobs that paid well, allowing them to contribute directly to the war effort and bolstering their confidence as workers and citizens. Yet it remained difficult, if not impossible, for individual Black people to challenge generations-old all-white workplaces. As thousands of migrants streamed into the Bay Area, the housing shortage deepened, forcing many Black families into makeshift, ramshackle, cramped quarters. Like women in general, Black women had to scramble to find childcare as local, state, and federal governments persisted in their historic refusal to provide support services for mothers of young children. Even though many women were working full-time, some on the night shift on behalf of the war effort. The war temporarily broke down some long-standing barriers so that women could perform what was previously designated as women's work, welding, riveting, and carpentry, for example. Yet after the war, women were displaced from their factory jobs by returning soldiers. White women resumed work as retail clerks and clerical staff, while Black women remained limited to employment as household domestics, cafeteria workers, and hospital aides. By 1950, the FEPC had been disbanded, and once again, employers could freely advertise that no Negroes need apply. Black unemployment rates soared. Because Black families continued to face stubborn challenges stemming from job discrimination and housing segregation, Black women's labor continued to be essential to the well-being of their households. While white men took advantage of the GI Bill to go to college, many Black men found their chances for higher education foreclosed by the lack of accredited, that is, white, colleges that would admit them. Banks engaged in pernicious redlining practices, which denied mortgage loans to even middle-class Black workers if they were living in an overwhelmingly Black area. In 1950, almost 30% of Black men between the ages of 20 and 24 were jobless, and employment patterns continued to reflect a Jim Crow occupational hierarchy. Residential segregation in particular played a major role in thwarting the aspirations of Black women in their roles as wives, mothers, and workers. Confined to impoverished neighborhoods, they often faced long commutes to work. Their inability to purchase a home meant that they would remain at the mercy of landlords who realized they housed a captive group of people who could not afford to move. In the suburbs, so-called neighborhood improvement associations put pressure on homeowners not to sell to people of color, a trend supported by real estate agents and city councils. All white towns enlisted local police in discouraging Black families from moving into their neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Authority and the Veterans Administration refused to grant loans to Black veterans who wanted to buy houses in white areas. City authorities segregated public housing, refusing to build enough units to accommodate the numbers of Black applicants. Federal policy favored suburban homeowners over urban renters by providing tax breaks for interest on mortgage payments, by creating an interstate highway system that frequently decimated Black communities, and by refusing to loan money to housing contractors who refused to segregate any new developments they built. The combined effects of these policies and practices among bankers, real estate agents, city officials, and builders meant that over the generations, Black families would lack the assets of their white counterparts who owned their own homes. In the post-war period, government jobs became the bedrock of many Black families. Black men and women worked as bus drivers, social workers, and teachers. Nevertheless, some public sectors such as law enforcement and firefighting resisted integrating their ranks, using formal examinations and other machinations as pretexts for discrimination. And some work sites, once integrated, showed hostility toward people of color, making life miserable for them. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 marked the end of the federal government's active attempts to apply discriminatory policies to housing and unemployment, and the beginning of federal enforcement of voting laws. With the crumbling of legislative mandates upholding racial segregation, and with affirmative efforts by colleges and employers to admit Black people in meaningful numbers for the first time, a segment of the Black population began to thrive, especially the well-educated. Yet the absence of legal barriers was not sufficient to open the way to a brighter future for many Black women. Indeed, a confluence of events in the 1960s and 70s conspired to keep large numbers in poverty and relegated to low-paying, disagreeable jobs. The Immigration Act of 1965 opened the country to groups who competed with Black people for unskilled jobs. By this time, certain industries had taken advantage of local tax incentives and moved to the suburbs, making it difficult for people who did not own cars to get to work. Other industries took their production facilities offshore or to Mexico in an attempt to avoid American unions and minimum wage and maximum hour laws. The global economy hit Black workers hard in the sectors they were just beginning to enter, textile production, for example. Some white-collar jobs, such as bank teller, were reduced or eliminated with the increased use of computers and robotics. In addition, a tax revolt among suburban taxpayers began to register in municipal budgets as towns and cities began to cut back on public employment in the transportation, education, and social welfare sectors, adversely affecting Black people who represented a disproportionate number of workers in those jobs. People in distressed communities such as Watts and Compton lacked access to well-paying jobs that did not require a college education, and they lacked the resources to move into middle-class white suburbs. The available jobs were concentrated in the service industry: fast food workers, home health aides, childcare workers. Without a substantial tax base, the public schools in these areas were unable to provide an adequate education to prepare students for the challenges of the 21st century global workforce. Underground economies thrived, and police targeted Black men and youth for nonviolent offenses such as drug use, leading to high rates of incarceration and leaving wives and mothers to try to piece together a living on their own. Recent studies suggest the limitations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, as a force for a level playing field when it comes to employment opportunities. Some employers persist in discriminatory practices, now using a person's zip code as a proxy for their race. The rise of a service economy and the decline in manufacturing have limited the number of well-paying jobs for people with only a high school degree. In the early 2000s, banks switched from redlining communities of color to pushing predatory loans on them, leading to high rates of foreclosure, especially after the financial crisis of 2008. Perhaps most significantly for most middle-class Americans, equity in a home is a family's largest asset in terms of their total net worth. In 2016, the net worth of a typical white family was nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family, $171,000 versus $17,000. Generations of Black women as workers, wives, and mothers have paid a high price for these forms of discrimination, their talents squandered and their dreams dashed. In 2019, the Public Policy Institute of California reported that about 1/3, or 34% of the state's residents were poor or near poor, including more than 1/5 of all Latinas and 17.4% of African Americans, compared to 12% of whites. While 12% of white women were impoverished, the figure for Black women was 23%. In 2019, the median annual earnings of white women stood at $55,000, for Black women $44,000. The discrepancy was even greater for men, $71,000 for white men, $48,000 for Black men. The COVID pandemic has had disastrous effects on Black communities. Some Black women lost their jobs as waitresses, fast food workers, and custodians, and others are overrepresented as frontline workers, serving as hospital orderlies and home health care workers, making more of them vulnerable to the virus. By way of conclusion, I do not mean to argue that Black Californians are the only group in the state who have endured systematic prejudice over the generations. However, the history of African Californians is unique because many of their forebears were enslaved in the American South. Government at all levels have initiated and enforced policies that limited Blacks' employment opportunities in direct and long-lasting ways. Indeed, federal agencies, local city officials, and school boards, law enforcement officers, together with state legislative and congressional inaction, have played a major role in limiting the ability of Black women to achieve material success and their highest potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for that incredibly informative expert testimony. We're looking forward to engaging with you further on this topic. Now I'd like to introduce our next expert witness, Lawrence Lucas. And Mr. Lucas, you may begin your testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the presenters. But I'd like for you to play a piece that was very striking that tells the depth and the breadth of Black farmers. Thank you.
I lost my livelihood in farming. I couldn't farm. They took away the one thing that I really loved, and that was farming. That's what the USDA did.
He showed me a big tarp that had the words on it, "Nigger, go home."
The lack of commitment by too many people to not really caring whether we did justice or not.
Even as long as it's been, we've experienced discrimination for a very, very long time, and most people would have given up. To this date, I haven't given up, and I never will give up, until justice is served.
That's what my daddy would always say. He says I wasn't in trouble or anything. Everything was fine until I went up to defend my dad. And he says, what was I supposed to do? He says, I'm a man, and that's my daddy. I'm supposed to defend him.
He said, don't let USDA take my land. It was like anybody else, but just don't you let them have it. And we've done that. Nobody else has taken it either, but for sure the USDA will never get it. Quite frankly, I say that the United States Department of Agriculture murdered them. My mother and father and my brother. Mm-hmm.
The number of acres lost by Black farmers are tremendous. Millions of acres we owned after slavery. And then we were reduced to this day to maybe 17 or 18,000 farmers and a small degree of land. What I want to say to you is that the present lawsuits that are brought against Black farmers by frivolous and racist individuals around the country will not stop our drive in the struggle for Black farmers. The income of Black farmers have drastically been reduced, and the amount of wealth that has been taken from Black farmers is tremendous, and it will be never again returned. What you would call reparations, we call it justice. What you have heard is only a part of why we do what we do, why you must do what you have to do in California to right the wrongs suffered by Black people. You call it reparations, we call it justice. Thank you, California Reparations Task Force, for inviting me here today and taking on, and we understand the daunting task that you have to right some of the wrongs for Black people in this country. I want to say that the Coalition of Minority Employees and the Justice for Black Farmer Group is honored to be here today. sending out a call, which you are sending out a call to your citizens. Again, I say, we call it justice. You call it reparations. Thank you, Ms. Moore, who heard a conversation talking about a letter that we sent to the Secretary of Agriculture in June 2 of 2021. If not for her seeing that tape, we wouldn't be here today. That letter and the testimony we submitted speaks to the same racism, sexism, and the retaliation and harassment that employees at the Department of Agriculture suffered, but also the pain and suffering of many farmers and employees. I'm sorry to say that things are not any better at USDA, and I'm sorry to say that it doesn't look like it's going to get any better under the times that we are faced. You have white farmers who own most of the land and get all the benefits from the land. They are the ones now bringing court cases around the country, saying that it's discriminatory to have debt relief for black farmers. When I experienced in my youth racism and sexism, it brought me to where I am today. And I'm sure that many of you all on this panel, that you have listened to your parents and you have experienced some of the same indignities that black farmers have suffered. You call it reparations. We call it justice. The reason why I'm here today is because I stand on the backs of pain and suffering of farmers and many other people in this country. If not for Dr. Tolson leading me to a book and a poem written by Robert Frost, Two Roads Diverge in a Yellow Wood, and I took the road less traveled by. I see what you all are doing in California is what needs to be done across this country. The courage of your governor and the courage of the people on this reparations committee to take on this daunting task and start by talking to other people about their pain and suffering. And thanks for including and getting an understanding of what black farmers have suffered, what women have suffered. We look at all the abuses that's going on in the country as it relates to sexual abuse, and we ignore what is going on at USDA in this nation. And that is because we've been failed by our leadership. We've been failed by our Congress. But we have faith, just like you all will have to have the faith and the strength as you work through this reparation issue with your citizens in California. The injustice they have received from your state and county, you have every right to do something about it. If not now, why? If not now, when? There must be accountability. There must be transparency. In order for a state and this nation to move forward. with a sense of humanity and dignity. Once a nation that had a rating of 95 in the world in terms of democracy, it is now 83 in the rating, in the world view. Melvin Van Peebles, actor, writer, producer, and more, wrote a play that I saw in my early years in New York. It was called Ain't Supposed to Die of Natural Death. It showed in its action a demonstration for rights and maybe even rioting. And then all of a sudden, money flowed down onto the stage, and the people went into slow motion. That is what's happening in this country. Our leaders and many of the people that are responsible for the pain and suffering of Black farmers are people that look like us, people that look like many of us. But we've come together as an organization, multiracial and multicultural, to stand up for the land loss, to stand up for the harassment, to stand up for the loss of wealth of Black farmers. We are sharing with you a culture of systemic racism at the U.S. Department of Agriculture that denies Black farmers their dignity, that denies Black farmers a right to farm, denies Black farmers the right to the same programs and services that white farmers get in this country. You call it reparations that's needed. We call it justice. The internal wheels of justice have been and still is slow in some of the cases that exist and the ones that you face. That share, we're going to share with you. And in the paper that we presented was probably somewhat different than all the others. We don't have a lot of charts. We only talk about the pain and suffering. We talk about the lack of humanity, the lack of dignity and respect that goes on at the Department of Agriculture. We were told by Secretary Vilsaps, who is now Secretary, that what we were asking for Black farmers in our effort to fight for justice for them, that debt relief was unconstitutional. We see today that that self-fulfilling prophecy of Tom Vilsapp and his group, with the filing of these frivolous and racist complaints around the country, yes, we see it as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those cases are frivolous that are brought against these farmers who are fighting for their dignity and respect in their land and their wealth. Black farmers and the lawsuits that are coming up in about a week or two in Tennessee will probably put, hopefully, a pin in what is going on in the lives of Black farmers. We thought that it was important that our group bring to the attention of the candidates running for president, both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren, we confronted with the fact that she thought and was told that the reason why black farmers are being discriminated against is because of heirs property. That's not true. People are lining up, by the way, with the money that's flowing out of Washington to benefit from the heirs property, while black farmers still today suffer cases not settled. I can't tell you the pain that I've felt with the number of black farmers that I've seen die, ill. Farmers passed on because they couldn't get the justice, because they could not continue to farm. They could not have a way of life like white farmers. That is very painful. But we went to Elizabeth Warren when she thought it was heirs property, and she sat down with us and her staff, and we were able to convince her, like we are still trying to convince the government, some of our leaders today, that the real reason that we have discrimination at the U.S. Department of Agriculture is because of the systemic discrimination at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That discrimination goes to the heart and to the heartland, where black farmers have to sit down and ask a racist county committee person or committee to give them the same benefits and services they give white farmers.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Let me say this. I want to close by saying thank you for the work that you have in front of you. And I want to remind you of what you saw when my presentation started. I thank you very much, but I'd like to use my last few seconds of putting on the tape that you saw in the beginning.
I lost my livelihood in farming. I couldn't farm. They took away the one thing that I really loved, and that was farming. That's what the USDA did.
He showed me a big tarp that had the words on it, nigger, go home.
The lack of commitment by too many people to not really caring whether we did justice or not.
Even as long as it's been, we've experienced discrimination for a very, very long time, and most people would have given up. To this date, I haven't given up, and I never will give up, until justice is served.
That's what my daddy would always say. He says I wasn't in trouble or anything. Everything was fine until I went up to defend my dad. And he says, what was I supposed to do? He says, I'm a man, and that's my daddy. I'm supposed to defend him.
He said, don't let USDA take my land. It was like anybody else, but just don't you let them have it. And we've done that. Nobody else has taken it either, but for sure the USDA will never get it.
Quite frankly, I say that the United States Department of Agriculture murdered them. My mother and father and my brother. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lucas, for that incredibly moving expert and personal testimony. We really appreciate it. Now we have Mirza Baradaran available. Welcome, Professor Baradaran. She is available from 11:35 to 12:05. So without further ado, she's scheduled to speak for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll reserve the balance for questions. Ms. Baradaran, you may begin when you are ready. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very sorry for the rush. We're on fall break, and I'm traveling today, so I apologize for that. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. Just a little bit about myself. I am a law professor who writes about banking, credit policies, and otherwise. I have no personal history connected to the truths that I will reveal. I'm actually an immigrant to America, and so I'm coming from this from a research angle, and so I submit my testimony in that light. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, the Black community owned less than 1% of the United States total wealth. More than 150 years later, that number has barely budged. The gap between average white wealth and Black wealth has increased over the last decades. Today, across every socioeconomic level, Black families have a fraction of the wealth of white families. And this wealth chasm doesn't abate with income or with education. In other words, this is a wealth gap that is very much tied to a history of exclusion and exploitation, and not, to be remedied by higher education or higher income. Without targeted policies to close this wealth chasm, it will continue to grow. And I want to be clear about how this racial wealth gap was created. It was created, maintained, and perpetuated through public policy at the federal, state, and local level, laws, policies, contracts, and the lack of protection of Black communities' property by the law, the enforced segregation by the federal and state bureaucracies that created a race-based bifurcated economy, created this historic racial wealth gap that self-perpetuates today without any necessity for added inputs. Black men and women have been shut out of most avenues of middle-class wealth creation. Black homes, farms, and savings were not given the full protection of the law, even as these properties were subject to racial terrorism. In employment, education, housing, farm loans, even patent rights, racist policies and practices have either shut Black communities out of the market entirely or offered them separate and subpar services. And this is despite Black banks, Black businesses, and Black communities having engaged in 150 years, if not longer, under brutal and hostile legal conditions to try entrepreneurship and self-help and coordination. The American middle class, however, was not created that way. It was not created through self-help and pull yourself up by bootstrapism. It was created principally through government-supported credit infrastructure that didn't cross the red lines the policymakers drew around Black neighborhoods. You can look today across California, in Los Angeles area, in the Fresno area, in the San Diego area, and San Francisco, and look at the initial red line maps that were created for those areas. And it will say explicitly on those red line maps that this is a neighborhood, with Black people, with these subversive races. Sometimes they talk about racial, inharmonious racial mix. And those red lines were drawn around those communities. And for the next almost 80 years, no public subsidized credit, neither mortgage credit or consumer credit, would pass through those red lines. These very same red line communities were then targeted with the most toxic loans during the subprime crisis. And with the blow up of the subprime crisis, the Black community lost another 53% of its wealth. This time, there were no federal guarantees. These communities have yet to recover from the blow when they were hit yet again with the devastation of the COVID crisis and the unequal distribution of the PPP loans. This is a system that can accurately be described, and I have written an article with this name, that it is a Jim Crow credit and capital system. It is separate and unequal. And many of these discriminatory policies of de jure exclusion have thankfully been explicitly abandoned. Yet the racial wealth gap remains because the damaging effects of these policies have never been directly remedied or counteracted. The wealth gap that those red lines put into motion continues and will continue unless it is disrupted by the same policymakers, namely the U.S. Congress, state Congresses, and regulators that oversee these bureaucracies. Or public services, I should say. In order to achieve true racial equity, we must reckon with the fruits of our nation's history. In fact, I believe that it is the myths that we tell about our history and the economy that present the biggest hurdles to achieving economic justice. Myths that blame those who were the targets of discrimination for disparities they did not create, and myths that offer personal responsibility instead of justice. In my work, I've tried to debunk two of these myths in particular. One, the myth of self-help finance as an avenue to wealth creation. I call this the George Bailey myth of the famous movie. And two is the myth of personal decision-making, the bootstrap myth. There are no amount of individual spending and savings decisions, no amount of lattes, avocado toast, or sneakers foregone, as public policymakers would advise, and no amount of hours worked that can counteract the forceful headwinds of historic policies. People do work hard, and people do make hard financial decisions, and yet they still face the legacies of racist policies in segregated schools, neighborhoods, and access to mobility. No matter what the family structure, the wealth gap exists. Black and white families who do everything, quote unquote, the right way, as some people on the right would say, get married, get an education, buy a home, start a business, save their money, and still the wealth gap persists. In fact, this gap is highest at the very top of the income and education ladder. So this is not caused by any personal decisions or cultural decisions, as a lot of racist explanations have offered over the last 100 years. And just to be clear, investing, working hard, getting an education, starting a business are all great things to do. And my point is not that these things aren't worth doing, it is that they have been done for centuries. From investing hard-earned wages into the Freedmen's Bank, to marching for jobs, to taking out a mortgage, these prudent financial decisions were often taken amidst a history of exclusion, exploitation, violence, and virulent racism. And quite frankly, outright land theft in California specifically. Black institutions have been creative and innovative in serving their communities in a hostile climate. I've written a book about the long history of entrepreneurship, self-help, and mutual uplift. HBCUs have provided stellar educations. Black banks have lent to Black businesses, churches, and families. They have offered credit where the FHA refused to guarantee loans. And Black families have invested in these homes at great personal cost. Their homes are valued less because they are in Black neighborhoods. This racial gap in home values is just one example of the tangible present effects of a history of exclusion. And the racial wealth gap is where past injustice breeds present suffering. In order to move forward, we must make public policy that disrupt the patterns that sustain disparities in wealth. For it is obvious, stated Dr. Martin Luther King, that if a man is entering the starting line in a race 300 years after another man, he would have to perform some impossible feat in order to catch up with his fellow runner. The racial wealth gap was created by exclusionary policies coordinated across the branches of government. It was created systematically through taxation, banking, housing laws, private markets sustained by federal subsidies. And this is exactly the level of holistic coordination across governmental agencies, federal, state, and local, that is necessary to close the racial wealth gap. President Biden recently said that we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole government. And I, in written testimonies I've written and other books, I've suggested several steps that can be taken to aimed at various sectors of the economy. And these efforts should be coordinated, tracked, and measured across governmental agencies through a dedicated task force for the sole purpose of closing the racial wealth gap. Policies must provide a meaningful path to capital creation, access to low-cost credit, financial inclusion, tax justice, and home ownership grants. In other words, the same programs provided to white families over the last century. And I want to be clear about this. Nothing short of a full reparations can meet the scale of the harm done. And even then, the harms are not fully remedied. They will not be remedied with as much money as we can use to remedy just the monetary benefits, because what remains are the psychological, the trauma of being subjects of terrorism historically and having those properties removed. Real reforms, however, require that we look directly at this history. We must design a holistic remedy with a singular mission to achieve the promises of justice and equality in our nation's constitution that we promised each other. And I will conclude again with the words of President Biden, because this is the current administration, that it's time to act now, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because if we do, we'll all be better off for it. So I appreciate the testimony. I'm here for questions of any kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Baradaran, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to provide such informative expert testimony. We truly appreciate it. So we heard from 4 experts, and the breadth of what we heard is just magnanimous, right? And so at this time, we have about 15 minutes reserved for comments and questions from task force members. And so at this time, if a task force member would like to be recognized for a question or comment, please do so. Vice Chair Brown, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the task force. And to our indescribable panel, you said it all. You stated the case. And all we need to do is to internalize the slogan of Nike, just do it. Langston Hughes said so eloquently, I swear to the Lord, I still can't see. Democracy means everybody but me. You all have stated the case of how this nation has masterminded the art of establishing exclusionary policies and practices that have denied sons and daughters of the darker hue economic justice, and all that we should have had has been taken away from us. Stennis and Eastland, both in Mississippi, came filthy rich through the soil bank program that I knew about in Mississippi when I was a child, back in the 50s and 60s. California, what was done to destroy Allensworth, that was established by a black preacher from Kentucky. We just need to pay up and not do a lot of talk up. And I trust that members of this panel will stay the course and continue to bring such expert, eloquent, erudite, excellent presenters. And we need to make sure that these testimonies are shouted from the housetop and throughout the length and breadth of this state of California. I end with this comment. It was Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays delivered his final charge to the graduates at Morehouse of the class of 1967. This man, who was the intellectual and spiritual mentor of Martin Luther King, said, and I quote him, "Our problem in the future will not come from the rabid segregationists like George Wallace of Alabama, Forwards of Arkansas, Lester Maddox of Georgia, or Ross Barnett of Mississippi. Our problem, said Dr. Mays, will come from the so-called aggressive white liberals who will wine and dine you in the swankies of hotels, sip tea with you, but will refuse to share economic and political power with you. This task force has a responsibility of, in a strategic, smart, persistent way, delivering on what you have revealed to us about reparations and justice that is done and not just talked about. Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me this opportunity, but I'm just full of myself now. Lord had permitted me to see 80 years plus and to witness all the horrors of Mississippi and come to the point of half-stepping on the rightness and the significance of this call for reparations in our time.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Brown, for that comment. Member Grills, you are recognized. You're on mute, Member Grills.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. I want to say thank you to the entire panel. Your testimony puts in stark relief the intersecting systems that must be addressed in any discussion of reparations. I want to address a quick question to Professor Jones. Your discussion of Black women invokes for me the Black family and further Black children. And I was wondering if you have any information on the issue of forced Black child labor immediately following emancipation. Things like the restrictive apprenticeship contracts where Black boys until they were 21 and Black girls until they were 18 were forced to stay first on the plantation that they were enslaved on. The former master got dibs. And it's a situation where Black parents, if they were there, were knowledgeable about this apprenticeship, petitioned the federal government to regain custody, but mostly to no avail. And this is not only an issue of intersecting systems, but the continuity of dynamics and patterns over time, because this is a fight we still see today in the child welfare system as Black parents fight for reunification with their children who are swept up into that child welfare process. Does your research include anything on that? When you start talking about Black women, you're talking about Black families and you're talking about Black children.
Yes. Well, Dr. Grills, you've explained the so-called apprenticeship program in the South already. And yes, it was a way for plantation owners to appropriate the labor of children, essentially take them out of the care of their parents, exploit them in the fields. I will say even children who weren't apprenticed were expected to work in the cotton fields until well into the 20th century. Anti-child labor legislation of the 1930s did not apply to the agricultural sector. And these children were supposed to be picking cotton, helping adults in the fields. So there was this general appropriation of child labor for a century or more after the end of slavery.
That's really good to know. So that child labor laws did not extend to agriculture.
Not through the 1930s. It was quite a bit after that. Many migrant laborers, agricultural workers, seasonal pickers were all excluded from the legislation, the social welfare legislation of the 1930s. And only gradually has that injustice been redressed for certain groups in the country.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Grills. Would any other task force member like to be recognized at this moment? Member Holder, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Moore. This is just a question addressed to anyone on the panel who would like to answer. Thank you for your testimony, very enlightening. You've all talked about the varying government programs as well as private industry policies and practices, but government programs specifically that created and embedded this wealth gap. I was wondering if you could speak to the issue, the Homestead Act specifically. Professor Baradaran talked about, the importance of housing and developing equity through housing, how that is kind of the critical piece in terms of building wealth, generational wealth. And so I wanted to hear a little bit about the Homestead Act and how that allowed white families to create generational wealth and excluded African Americans from those opportunities.
I can take a stab at this a question. I mean, depending on the historical moment, there were different ways that the federal government helped wealth creation, and obviously, during the institution of slavery, during enslavement, it was capital, property, and man, right? So the bodies of Black men and women were used as a means of wealth in the South, especially, but also in the North from the cotton that it produced. After that, from Reconstruction until about the 1930s, it was land, it was farming land, and that was given through the Homestead Act for free, or a few dollars to white families who moved west, and for a variety of reasons, Black families did not get them. It was not just exclusion, but also the hostility of the Southern sharecropping system that relied on Black labor, and that the really onerous sharecropping arrangement that W.E.B. Du Bois calls basically re-enslavement through debt. And so the Homestead Acts were not only not offered, but the debt economy sort of kept Black farmers trapped in those conditions. And so that was the era that kind of ended with the Industrial Revolution. And then post New Deal, it has been mortgage subsidies and GI bills and all of that sort of government subsidized credit through the secondary markets and other things. And so that is not to say that for now, the primary driver is homes and land, but it is for the large majority of Americans. The top now 1%, there is a large source of capital in sort of abstractions like stocks and markets and bonds and sort of the global system of capital. But for the middle class, it really is a home, because a home is not just your equity, it is also the access you have to schooling, through home taxes, through transportation. Often because of the redlined areas and that history of exclusion, the most environmentally polluting sources are in those formerly redlined areas that are usually Black and brown communities. The degradation of the environment is paid, that cost is paid most by Black and brown families, especially in California. And those are all tied at this point to housing segregation.
Member Grills, did you have another question?
Sorry, okay. Yes, this is for Professor Baradaran. You mentioned that nothing short of full reparations would begin to close the wealth gap. And I was wondering if you might itemize what full reparations would mean.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm going to go to some legal principles here. I teach contracts law to UCI Law School to 1Ls every year, and I'm teaching 2 sections this year, so this is all fresh in memory. In contracts, we have a form of damages where and this happens in complex litigation. If you look at any massive scale problem like the 9/11 loss of life or opiates, the legal system measures damages to make one whole. So if there's a contract breach, you pay damages to make that person who you breached against whole. Now, what does whole mean? Well, it is the lost things that they didn't get because of that breach. And if we look at the breach, I mean, we can go all the way back to the 1619 arrival of the first ships of human beings in chains, or we can go to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which were an explicit promise to Black communities for equal protection under the law, due process, and those were violated. That's breach. And so how do you make a community whole based on breach over and over again? And so you restore the lost wealth. And this is where you go to outcome-driven responses. So how do you close the racial wealth gap? Well, it was created across sectors. It was created by the Federal Reserve, by federal legislation, through credit policies, through the secondary market, through local school boards and zoning ordinances, and all of those mechanisms. And so you bring those together to fix it. And one thing that could be done is, look, you have every agency has 5 years to, in your agency, close the racial wealth gap, and let them put the burden on the agencies that offer these subsidies. The Federal Reserve is a big one. Put the burden on them, and they can figure out how to do it, because that's where they know individually where those where the bodies lie, essentially. And the school boards, the same thing. I think you would say equalize the outcomes, and you would get there. But I do want to say that even with full-scale reparations, people are not made whole. And that's something that we must recognize, is, looking at the Jewish people getting reparations from Germany. And I think you ask any person, were you made whole? Absolutely not. And same with the Japanese internment, victims. And so it's not to reach some sort of justice. That is won't be achieved, but it is the least we can do, I think, as a moral duty.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I know, Marissa, you have like 3 minutes left until you have to jet off. Does anyone have another additional direct question for Professor Baradaran? So I have a question it's posed to any panelist really, but maybe to Professor Baradaran and Professor Spriggs. We have been talking about the task force subpoena power and our power to, subpoena individuals, entities, agencies. And so I was wondering if you all had any insight in respect to your field of study, what entities we should look into. I have another question, but I'll just stop it there for now because it's separate and apart from the question I just posed.
Marcia, you're getting ready to go. Did you want to?
No, go ahead, William. I defer to you.
Well, I think there are a host of agencies that need to come full circle. We saw the recent reveal about land that had been taken from a family for animals there in California, and California has responded by restoring the property. But the same sort of deliberations that went on in the building of the highways in Los Angeles and the disruption to communities, those decision-making processes need to be looked at closely to understand why those neighborhoods, why those paths, this is very important for the Bay Area, for Black communities in the Bay Area, the displacement that took place. It's also important to look at these denials of opportunity. As I pointed out, the lack of Black teachers in the California system prior to the 1960s, the whole set of decision making to look at processes of recruitment, processes of making those kind of decisions. The point is to show agency, to show that this didn't just happen, that people were making conscious decisions of exclusion. And so that kind of document is helpful. It's helpful because, getting back to some comments others have made, when you have open mic, so to speak, with the community, it's to understand what has to be corrected, and that those are some of the places I think you want to begin to point to. The whole Hollywood industry needs to be accounted for. Silicon Valley, for its lack of black programmers. Slides I didn't present, but Silicon Valley gets away with it. 25% of the computer programmers in Atlanta are black. Almost 16% of the computer programmers here in the Washington, D.C. area are black. This area in Washington maintains our national security, the NSA, the CIA. These are disproportionately black programmers. And for Silicon Valley to be 5%, that is California sort of wink, wink, nod, nod. We're not going to pay attention to discrimination right here in our borders. And so I think you want to get at these actors and understand their thinking.
I'll add to Bill's testimony that that's really important to look at the what's been lost. And I would use like a simple subpoena power. I would look at every city and locality on eminent domain. I mean, looking at the Bruce Beach example, just every single decision. Bill said roads, but any sort of eminent domain, and whether there was a disproportionate effect on Black communities. One, and two, I would look at the contracts. For each federal government contracting, and whether there was any sort of diversity in that. And third, I would look at zoning decisions and their effects. There are some avenues looking at disparate impact to kind of challenge zoning decisions that have clearly had a disparate impact. I mean, I'm calling here from Orange County, California, or that's where I live, and that. The whole county, I would say, is in violation of zoning, toward racial inequity.
Thank you. So we've run out of time, but just for the record, I wanted to ask Professor Spriggs and Mr. Lucas, but another question. But for Professor Spriggs, I noticed in your presentation you showed a man who was an expert in radio technology, and one of the tabs said that he was a native of Trinidad. I assume that's the island of Trinidad. And so I was curious, we had a conversation about the community of eligibility yesterday. We were talking about who should be eligible for reparations. And we talked about, should Black Americans descend from chattel slavery? What about maybe some Black immigrants who, migrated to the United States not post-Reconstruction, pre-mass incarceration, kind of that area between, the early 1900s to 1965. What about that group, right? And so, I mean, it's just an objective question that I was just wanted to put out there. If you had any insight in your field of study, the idea, the field of data disaggregation is new. So, that type of data, tracking, who came from where wasn't necessarily the case, particularly in the 1900s. And then also, I'm sure a lot of, Black immigrants who did migrate here in the early 1900s probably integrated into Black American families, but I don't necessarily want to assume that. And so, I'm trying to tailor the question, but I just wanted to make note of that observation and figure out if you had any insight as to the community of eligibility in regards to those few, maybe, Black immigrants who were there in America and might have faced discrimination between that period. Does that make sense?
Yes, the question makes sense. It's I think important to note again, where does some of the worst of the wealth gap come from? And there was some convergence which was happening up through 1900. It starts to stall, and it stalls tremendously when we get around the period of 1900 to 1920. Black farm owners, because they were starting with zero, relied heavily on credit to acquire land and the acts of violence, intimidation, but the dramatic drop in farm prices in 1920 wiped them out because they were more leveraged than white farm owners. So you see us peak somewhere around 1918 in terms of land ownership, and then it collapses. And then there are complications dealing with black banking during the 1920s as well. So a lot of the wealth gap is a set of actions that take place after 1920. A lot of it. So you have to make up in your mind, what do you do? Do you only treat the people who were here before, or do you talk about the massive amount of discrimination that took place during that period of ultra violence, of economic denial? Do you compensate people for that too?
Thank you. So are there any last questions from the task force members to our esteemed panelists, recognizing that we are over time? I just want to thank all of our panelists, Professor Spriggs, Professor Jacqueline Jones, Professor Baradaran, and of course, Mr. Lawrence Lucas. This is the 2-year effort, and this is the first of many conversations on these topics. And so we're looking forward to, continuing to further these conversations, and we hope to bring you all along this journey as well. So thank you again for your time. At this time, we will go to lunch, which will end at 1 p.m. So at this time, we'll go to lunch. Thank you.
Thank you for including us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Thank you, Professor Spriggs. And sorry we kind of cut short, Mr. Lucas. I know you were ready to get some questions going, but we hope to continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for the video. It was great.